Hello, my name is Kai, and I am a bit of a rambler. I like to travel, learn, and tell stories. And I want to talk about India. Really, just all of the lessons from India I learned when I landed there. Because I didn't know much about the actual country of India before I visited India. And like every other country, whatever people had told me, I just kept that off to the side because it isn't uncommon to receive advice about places that the people giving the advice haven't been to, and that is safe enough advice to ignore. People are quick to offer advice and warnings about things they haven't directly experienced but have heard about before, second, third, fourth hand, or perhaps in a movie or TV show. Stand-up routine? So whenever someone tells me something about a country, I tend to reserve judgment until I land there myself. This wasn't too difficult to do with India in one respect, because India, in a certain respect, is even more alien to Americans than China, because it's not even reported in the news. Like, Americans don't know anything about China. But when people found out I was going there, a lot of people had a lot of advice, directly related to common headlines in the US American news articles about the physical danger of moving to China and the difficulty of learning the language and just a lot of other incorrect assumptions about China, as I found out after I lived there. But China's in the newspaper a lot, at least recently. It was getting more popular in news culture before I moved over there. Because before I moved over there, before 2012-ish, China was opening up. There were a lot of ties being made between countries, and Chinese culture was kind of actively trying to take on a role on the world stage and in popular culture. There were a lot of international ties and developments based on cooperation with other countries before Xi Jinping, so those deals were being reported on a lot, 10, 13 years ago or so, and there was that oft-repeated quote, "China is a sleeping giant, when she wakes the world will tremble," or something like that, and I definitely think about that whenever I think about India now as well. India, on the other hand, still hasn't reached anywhere near that level of pop culture saturation. Plus, historically, they had a couple stars from China, Bruce Lee, Jackie Chan, Jet Li, and China still has plenty of ways to go themselves. I mean, K-pop has become so popular these days, Korean pop. But when I was growing up, J-pop was much more popular than Korean pop. Now Korean pop's the big thing. But there are bands in China that have millions more fans than BTS or any of the K-pop bands, but you just don't hear about them yet because China has been unsuccessful so far at exporting a lot of their pop culture. And with that said, India to an even lesser extent. So yeah, in one respect, I really didn't have to worry about pushing the fears of other people to the back of my mind because they were the same vague anxieties I often hear about most countries that people know nothing about. And so at this point, most of what I've heard about India comes from people who have traveled there. And whenever someone who hadn't traveled there told me what they thought they knew about India, it was easy to shrug off because I heard it so infrequently. People can make assumptions about China because at least it's in the news, so they think they've heard something about it. But India's not even in the news very often. There's no ties to it. It's really pretty fascinating. So that's why I decided to go there, because I felt like a decade plus after I started traveling, I still knew nothing about India, on the same level of nothing I knew about China when I first moved to China 15 years ago. And boy, was that correct. When I got to India, everything I thought I knew about India was wrong. at least as represented by the people of the state I visited. They have 28 states in India, and I flew into Bhubaneswar, the capital of Odisha, and I stayed in the town called Atala. I think there are very few map borders, but the region of the town, I believe, was called Atala. And I was in a house recently built in the middle of farmlands. So I was not even in the city of Bhubaneswar in the state of Orissa. I was outside of even the suburbs. I was really far outside of the city in any respect. And that's what I was looking for. I wanted a very rural experience because I assumed the city would be like any other city. And when I went into the city sometimes from my house, it was like that. It was just a city. But there were so many fundamentals that were interesting to discover, and one of them is still blowing my mind. And if you're from India, definitely write in and explain to me your understanding of these revelations that I've had. Or that Indian people explained to me anyway. Oh, because the first thing I should note is that there are more fluent English speakers in India than in any other non-native English-speaking country I visited. There are a shocking amount of fluent English speakers. And when I say fluent, maybe not perfect, maybe not native sounding every time, so they know all of the colloquialisms, but fluent, as in it would be pretty difficult to tell they were a non-native speaker if you only heard them talking for a paragraph or two. Or if you gave them a book, they'd be able to read it totally normally without any stutters or stumbles. They'd be able to put together very complex concepts and ideas and sentences. That was probably the first shocker to me because India has now a larger population than China because their birth rate has been going up while everyone else's has been going down. Or rather, no, that's not right. It's actually China's is going up and India's birth rate is going down, but China's is maybe going up because the numbers are so small that it's difficult to tell. They've gone from like 6.3 to 6.6, basically, or 6.4 to 6.7. Whereas India's is going down, but it's going down from 18 children per 1,000 to 17 children per 1,000. So it's almost 3 times as high as China's. So even though the Indian birth rate is falling, they're still having far more children than most other countries. So they've already passed 1.7 billion in India. That's why I went there, because it's such a huge country. And I think the same thing that is happening with China will happen with India. That was my initial impression after a few days when I was there and I was seeing the people working in shops and just the shocking amount of fluent English speakers. Doing business in China is not easy. There are translators and they can help you start your business in China and they can help you sell your product in China. But there's no interest in forging cultural ties, especially officially, these days. And while that's also difficult for any country in 2025 to forge ties with the USA, India is a lot closer culturally to the US than China is. Maybe not at its fundamental building blocks levels, but certainly in its willingness to cooperate with other countries to build a future together. India is interested in that. They're interested in developing their cities and their technologies in cooperation with other countries. And China was never interested in that. They were, even at their most open 15 years ago, they were still trying to convince themselves, the governmental level, to connect and share with other countries. And ever since 2010, that has gone completely in reverse, and they're becoming more and more isolationist. Whereas India, it has such a huge workforce, and they're very advanced in many technological fields, and they're extremely interested in working with other countries. So while they don't have the capital that China does to invest in infrastructure around the world, they do have the people, the manufacturing capabilities, the expertise, and the land and natural resources, and the workers to match China's factory output. So I think in 20 years, we're going to see another huge force enter the world market, just like China has been. The reason China became so important was because every country made them into the world factory. And then they just had the factory infrastructure to export all these products. But it was because rich countries made China do it. They entered them into labor agreements where China would export all the cheap products. So with China isolating itself, everybody could move manufacturing to India, and the same thing could happen. I don't know what's going to happen, but with an even larger population than China, and about the same size as China or the US, which are almost exactly the same size, the two countries, it's pretty fascinating for me to visit another country and see all of these flags, all of these ensigns of progress that were obvious in China when I landed. I was like, oh, this is the next world power. And then landing in India, and even though they are not as technologically advanced in every part of India as China was when I landed, it's still easy to see that they are progressing extremely quickly, and much more quickly, I think, than the rest of the world is aware of. Certainly much more quickly than I was aware of. And there are so many English speakers there, fluent English speakers, and not just in the city and not just in professional capacities, but just random people. And not always professionals who were almost all fluent English speakers, but very often the poor and working class farmers who you may not think would have time to practice English. A lot of them were fluent as well, and would stop me to have a short chat while I was on my way somewhere. I could not believe how many people spoke fluent English, because India, like China, knows that English is the language with which to connect to the rest of the world. But in China, they study it all their lives, or they did. It's not compulsory in Chinese primary education anymore to study English, but a lot of families still send their kids to private schools. But even though they study a lot in China, there are not anywhere near the amount of fluent English speakers or even conversational English speakers I met in India. A random guy selling notebooks where I got my sketchbook so I could do sketches, he spoke fluent English. A guy riding a bicycle next to mine flagged me down so he could start talking to me, spoke fluent English. And this is in my rural countryside home, like a mile outside of the city. People living in houses without power, many of them were still fluent in English. It was incredibly impressive and very noteworthy, and it was bizarre to encounter so many high-level English speakers living in relative poverty, but thinking in prisms of cultural color, just so alive with the interest in learning and connecting. So that was fascinating because I am very white, and when I landed in Bhubaneswar, I landed and I saw a couple other people that were not obviously Indian, not many, on my flight and in the airport. And then when I left the airport, I only saw Indians for the 3 months I was there. So very low visiting rate. Not many tourists go to India, statistically and anecdotally. And the only two things I hear from every single person who talks about traveling to India is, oh, well, it's so dirty, so I don't know if I want to go there. And that's actually a reason why I didn't go for as long as I did, even though it's such a huge country and culturally obscure to me. I know nothing about it. I lived in China, and China is very dirty, especially in rural areas. There's open sewage lines, and yeah, it's smelly. Or large parts of China can be very smelly, and they don't clean their bathrooms very well compared to the Western standards I expect. They don't use bidets in China. And after living in China for so long, I didn't want to go to India and encounter similar unhygienic places after I had just lived in that environment for so long. But then I landed in India, and to my shock, which even the people who had been to India warned me that it's kind of a dirty place or it's not super clean, it's cleaner than China. And the craziest thing for me was that there was no sewage smells, which is extremely rare. I can't tell you how rare this is. The States might, well, no, because the States has open sewage pipes inside the cities that you'll smell. I don't know. It's difficult to think of a country that has fewer offensive smells than India. And that is bearing in mind the coal they use in the country, which is made of dehydrated cow manure, which I'll get into in a bit. But yeah, so if when I was living in China, I would ride my bike down this road, and I knew that for 100 meters or so, there was an open length of sewage pipe, and it was just a waste trickling river. I don't want to say it was a trickling waste. It was a waste river next to the side of the road, and that wasn't covered. For the years that I lived in this town, like 2.5 years or something. And then there are plenty of places in China that you can smell the smell of waste in the city. There will be a not covered pipe, or the sewer will just be open like to the sidewalk, and you can smell the bad smells coming from there because the sewage system just is not complete. The infrastructure isn't set up to block the smells in China. And that's pretty common. You'll notice it. You'll walk around. It's not everywhere in the city, but if you walk around enough, well, it's not everywhere in Beijing anyway, but if you walk around enough, you'll certainly smell giant trash smells and human waste smells, and they'll just pop up and then they'll be gone after like 30 meters or something. But there are some very smelly streets in China. Now, as far as human waste goes, that is not atypical to many countries. I walk around a lot. That's my thing. I backpack and I just walk for long places. And I'll get that smell. It'll pop up when I'm walking around a city. It'll pop up when I'm walking around rural areas that maybe connect sewage lines down to the city. Sometimes they're just not maintained, and that's in pretty much every country I've ever been to. The States, Japan even, a couple times there's a bad, what I assume is a sewage smell. Taiwan has it, and that's an otherwise very clean country, but for some reason they do have several streets where you can smell sewage or waste. Even in Kaohsiung, the big city. And India did not. Bhubaneswar, anyway, I'll say, did not. Bhubaneswar, in the 3 months I was there, had one area where I could smell an unpleasant smell, and it wasn't crazy, but the fact that I could smell it at all, the sewage or waste, shocked me because I hadn't smelled it for the first 2 months I was there, 6 weeks or something, and I had been going all through the city, riding my bike around, walking down many streets, and I lived in a very rural area. And I had read articles about the rural population using the bathroom in the fields and just in the public in India. So I was prepared for these offensive smells, which I don't like, but I had lived in China. I was like, if I can get through that minefield of offensive odors, I can certainly handle India for however long I decide to stay there. But they didn't have the smells. And they also didn't have a lot of trash. In terms of dirty countries, India, given its poor reputation, I'm sorry to report in case you're unaware of this, it was not very dirty in terms of refuse piled on the side of the road, which is a problem in almost every country. Japan, no, because they do that very well. But Japan still had a couple weird sewage smells, which very rare, but it did occur. But India, Bhubaneswar, this fairly rural town that's the city, but the town I was in outside of the city, I rode around every single part of the town I was in, for miles outside of it and into the city, and I was just blown away. I was like, wow, this is amazing. And I talked to someone who worked on sewage lines, and I talked to a student who knew about how sewage lines worked because she was studying for a crazy test that made sure she knew everything. And they both explained that offensive odors are like anathema to Indian culture. And so all of their sewer systems are built lower and they're covered 2 or 3 times so that no smell leaks out. And yeah, that was amazing to me, because I bet if I asked Chinese people, they'd be like, oh no, we're very modern. We have sewage. There are sewers that run and get collection points and all that. And that's true. They do have sewers that lead to collection and treatment centers, but they also have many stretches of smelly waste that you can smell from underground or from beside the road. And they have piles of garbage in a lot of places. Bhubaneswar did not have either of those. And the entire time I was there was one time where I smelled waste, and it looked like they were working on something rather than it just being an open sore in the earth, which is how I think of a lot of open sewer smells. So I don't even know if that was because they were working on it or not. But the lack of offensive odor was very encouraging staying in that country, and very surprising, because the one thing I heard from both people who had traveled there and people who had never traveled to India was, watch out, it's so dirty. And after living there for 3 months, I think I figured out why it has that reputation. Because it's certainly not because of the trash, because there isn't much trash around. You'll find a Coke bottle on the side of the road or something, but there are not mounds of trash like there are in a lot of other countries. I think one, because there are dirt roads everywhere, and it's a fairly dry climate. They're as common as paved roads out in the town I was at. So you have dust in the air, so it's literally dirty, as in there is dirt covered in a sickly refuse, contaminated in some way. But there are many dirt paths and dirt roads in India, and even the paved roads, many of those have literal soil on them, just regular brown ground soil, because there are not many sidewalks, and any area that is not habitated in India is largely left wild. They'll maybe cultivate it so the trees don't grow over the road or something like that, but they leave most of the nature alone, which is pretty cool, pretty interesting to see. But instead of making a wide swath of concrete around most habitated areas, as is pretty common in lots of places, any rural roads will be literally dirty with soil, just like dirt, or cow patties. So cows are allowed to roam all around India. And what's really interesting is that the dung the cows leave on the road has no smell. Like, I'll ride my bike, ride around a cow patty, or sometimes I'll be walk around one, and there's no smell coming from it. None of the disgusting manure smell you might be familiar with if you're around a farm in the States where they are fed a lot of corn. I am not sure by any means, because I'm not a farmer or a biologist, but cow waste smells terrible in the States. And in India, cow waste smells, if you smell it, like wet grass. But like I said, there's usually no smell. It's really interesting from a biological perspective. And so I assume some of that, even if it gets picked up to use in coal after they dehydrate it, I assume some of that gets on the road. Some of that is on the road. So that might be part of the dirt. So I'm assuming between the cows that are allowed to roam around and sometimes leave dung on the roads, and the literal soil from the ground that is on the roads, it has a dirty reputation. And I'm sure 30 years ago, things were a lot dirtier. But today, there are apartment buildings with indoor plumbing and toilets, even out where I am in the middle of literal fields. There's nothing around me, very small town, but everyone lives, well, I'll say most of the people live with indoor plumbing. All the people I met and knew who ran all the businesses and who were walking or just stopped to talk to me on the street, they all had indoor plumbing in their houses. And I don't think everybody did, because there's too much people. There are too many people living out in the country. I can't imagine they all have their houses hooked up to indoor plumbing. And I did know some locals who had to collect water every day. But I went through fields all the time. I went through rural areas. I went through along rural roads that weren't anywhere close to a city. And I never saw human waste on the side of the road or something like that, which I would see in China occasionally. You'll see waste on the side of the road where someone couldn't hold it. But that was not an issue in India. Like I said, it was startlingly clean considering its unfortunate reputation that I think is more legacy and due to, like I said, the actual topsoil and just having dirt roads everywhere, so it's literally dusty in a lot of areas. Okay, and the other thing that I think contributes to the perspective of India being dirty is that a lot of people cook with their hands, or they make the food with their hands. I understand this perspective that if you have dirty hands and, you can contaminate the food you're making and that sort of thing, I want to preface that with some places do use utensils to cook, even the roadside stands. Some places do use gloves for hygienic purposes. Most people do not. Many of the street food stands, use their hands to make food, Golgappa, which I'll go into later. But I think there are a few important points here. One is that all the people that I saw who made food with their hands also had a bucket of water or a container of water next to where they were making the food, like on their stand. And before they would make the food like Golgappa, which is like a small fried ball of dough, like just a shell, like a puffy ball, and you crack a hole and they put a paste of mixed diced vegetables inside and then a little bit of soup, and you eat it and it's delicious. And they hand it to you. It's awesome. But before they make anything, they always dip their hands and wash them in the water that's right there. Now, you're thinking, oh, that water is old, whatever. I never saw a dirty hand washing container, and they're usually in like a clear plastic container or something. The water always looked clean enough to me. And I ate street food literally every day in India for 3 months straight, and I never had any problems with my stomach. Now, I have a pretty good constitution, my stomach. I've been pretty lucky with that, and now I do the 1 meal a day thing, and that certainly helps. But I'll say, in addition to having the hand washing station at every place I visited, or I'll say nearly every place, I'm sure there were a couple people that didn't have them, but by and large, people who, especially the ones who made Golgappa, which is completely made with their hands, had hand washing stations, and I ate Golgappa a lot. Another very important fact is that India is largely vegetarian. Golgappa is entirely vegetarian. So it's not like they're grabbing raw meat, and it's not like the meat has been sitting out all day. They are using diced vegetables in a bucket, and that's what they grab and put inside these crisp fried dough balls, and then dip in the soup so you can eat it. But it's not like there's a cutting board or utensils that have old or contaminated meat on them. It's just ginger and carrots and garlic, just a bunch of diced vegetables. And they're always fresh. The quality of all the vegetables are always super fresh because a lot of people there are farmers and there are farmer markets everywhere. And so it's very easy to choose the fresh vegetables instead of the older vegetables. And that's certainly another thing. I never went to a restaurant and thought, oh, this isn't fresh. Literally everything I had was the freshest I could imagine it being. I imagine because there are those fresh markets, there are farmers markets almost every day, all around the place. And then there are also fresh markets just by local farmers, and they just have a little shop on the side of the road, and you can buy fresh vegetables from their farm directly from them. So I think India being a vegetarian place plays a huge part in the no smell of the cows, maybe the no smell of the sewage, because that's the first largely vegetarian country I've been in, and it's the first country where I didn't smell human waste in a few places around the city or along outside rural roads. And I know that if I eat only vegetables, my waste does not smell as bad as when I eat meat. And I eat meat a lot, and I love beef jerky, but I know if I eat beef jerky and meat, my waste does not smell particularly fresh. And in India, I actually went vegetarian for a while, and I noticed that there was a distinct lack of offensive odor when I was going to the bathroom compared to what I was used to. So I do think that the vegetarian diet is contributing to that lessening of odor that I experienced across the entire country, or entire state, I mean, since I was just in Orissa, which is pretty amazing. I don't think everybody should go vegetarian, but it was, man, when the vegetarian food tastes like Indian food, it's not real hard. So the first thing I always heard from everybody when I told them I was going to India, or I've been to India, or I asked people about India was, it's not clean. It can be dirty. Or, it's dirty, isn't it? And having gone there, and according to my standards of hygiene, which are, I don't know, maybe less. You already know I like bidets, so maybe they're more to you. I don't know, more strict. But relative to the other 36 countries I've been to, not much difference in hygiene. It's an incredibly clean country. Like, the fact that there are no smells, I feel like I'm fairly particularly sensitive to offensive odors. And so when there is an odor coming from a sewage, I smell it. I note it and I move by it. I don't get used to those smells. And in China, in the US, in many countries I've been to, I'll be like, ugh, can you smell that? And the locals don't smell it because they're kind of used to that area smelling bad. I'm like, no, that is raw sewage down that hole for sure. But they walk by it every day, so they don't notice it. I certainly noticed it. And I do notice it now. And it was not there. The smell of waste was not present in India for the 3 months I was there. So between that and then like no offensive or waste sewage odors, and the fact that people preparing food with their hands doesn't really bother me if their hands are clean, and especially if I don't get sick from it. And other Indians were like, oh no, you can't eat street food, it's not clean. Like some Indians told me that, but I was like, oh, I've been eating street food for 2 months straight without a problem. And then the literal dust on the streets. And then add to that the perception of India, since nobody actually travels there, is all from reported explorers and travelers from a generation ago, largely. What do you know about Indian history? Colonial rule by the British. That was a long time ago, but that is what most of us know about Indian history, I assume, because that's all I ever hear about. So I think the archaic historical perspective of even modern India, coupled with they prepare food with their hands, and there's literal dust on the roads because there are dirt roads in a lot of places, make people think that India is still dirty, but it is one of the most hygienic, in my opinion, because there were no offensive odors or visible waste or trash around in giant piles like you see in New York. Bhubaneswar and its surrounding countryside was as clean as most other cities I've been to, and there was no significant difference between the cleanliness of India, the parts that I saw, and other countries that had dirt roads. Maybe Mumbai's crazy, because it's so, much more populated and all that, but Bhubaneswar, and especially the outside town neighborhood that I was living in, very clean. And I will add to that anytime I visited someone's house, it was spotless when I went inside. And during the day, you'll see people sweeping outside almost ritualistically, like everyone is sweeping. Even if it's an outdoor store, they're sweeping their patio and sweeping the concrete ramp leading up to their storefront. Always, the Indian people that I lived around were constantly cleaning. They were just always cleaning their homes. So it was, a very clean place. And not just relative to my expectations based on what people guessed India was like, but definitively clean and constantly being cleaned and tidied. The hygienic nature of India was surprising to me, and I'm very glad it was as clean as it was. And it made my stay much more pleasant than it otherwise could have been. And I want to kind of continue on that frame because I found it fascinating that the cow waste had no smell, cow dung, whether I walked by it or rode a bike by it, or I walked by like 8 pieces of cow dung on the side of the road where a herd of cows were. There just was not the smell I associate with animal waste. If I was walking by it, and if I did smell it, it smelled like wet vegetation. It smelled like wet grass. But it wasn't particularly offensive. Just smelled like wet grass. And a very faint smell of wet grass. Nothing overpowering. Maybe not exactly the same, but it smelled like wet grass when you walk through a rainforest or something. When you're in the middle of a forest, there are some earthy tones to it. But it never smelled like manure, like the smell I'm used to in the States. And that was baffling to me, frankly, because I don't know if you've been around cows, their dung is large, and you would think it would smell bad. And in India, it doesn't smell bad. And they let their cows graze all day. And the cows are grazing on lots of different plants because, like I said, they don't monoculture the sides of their roads in India. So one side of the road might have 30 different plants just naturally growing. They just don't mess with it. Whereas in the States, of course, cows eat one type of hay with corn, like a couple plants, and it's corn produced, in a monoculture. It's just one nutrient. And I bet having a diverse diet, we know that having a diverse diet is much better for your gut bacteria than having a diet of one type of food only. And in India, those cows are eating, like I said, like 30 different kinds of plants easily all day, and they're just eating all this different food. And again, I'm not a veterinarian, I can't say exactly that's why, but it sure seems like this wild grazing on a range of plants has completely changed the animal, because I don't like milk. I didn't like milk growing up in the United States. I always thought it tasted sour and weird, and it didn't matter how fresh it was. Milk in the United States always tasted sour and just odd to me. There was something that didn't agree with me with US American milk. And I drank it because my parents said I had to. So I did, but I was like, why are we drinking this? This is so weird. I don't get it. And I still don't have a taste for milk much. I like cheese, but I don't like even fresh US American milk. And when I was in India, I had fresh milk, and it tasted like a completely different beverage. It tasted fresh, and it's basically the only time I think I tasted fresh milk. There was I literally have a memory of one time, the whole time I lived in the US growing up for 21 years, or whatever it was, 25 years. One time I had milk and it tasted like a fresh drink. And I was like, oh, this doesn't taste sour and gross. And I drank it and it tasted good. And then I never had that again. So I don't know what that was about, because I do have a very distinct memory of one time drinking fresh milk in the US. But other than that, it was always slightly sour, even if the expiration date was as far away as it could be, because my mom was the kind of mom who would hunt for the farthest away expiration date in the milk fridge. But all of the milk I had in India tasted like that one day in the US. It tasted like a different beverage. It tasted very fresh and tasty. It tasted good. And I can only attribute that to their diet as well. Eating fresh plants instead of processed monocultures like in the US, because I liked milk all of a sudden in India. It made sense to me as a food additive finally, at like 36 I was, however old I was, 37. And I had finally had milk for the first time that I was like, oh, this is good. I get why people like milk. I don't understand why US Americans like milk. That stuff mostly it just tastes weird to me and kind of sour. But it tastes fresh and good in India. And I didn't know if that was me, like just my perception of the milk or what. But when I met this girl who lives full-time in New York, but she's from India originally, and she spends time in each country. She spends time in each country. Tongue broke. She spends time in each country every year. And when we were talking, she just randomly brought up, and the milk, American milk, is gross. I can't drink it. I have to find some farmer somewhere, the 1 out of 1,000, who doesn't use monocultures with their cows, and I have to pay him $25 for a quart of actual fresh milk. And I was like, okay, I think I recognize the same thing, because India is the first time in my life I've enjoyed drinking milk. It's always tasted sour and weird to me, for as long as I was growing up in the US. So I have at least one person who has lived in both countries and agrees that cow products taste entirely different in India. It's insane how different the milk tastes to me. And fresh cheese. Like paneer rocks. I am very much into paneer, which, if you aren't familiar with it, is basically just cheese curds. So you, instead of adding cream to it like you would with cottage cheese, you just have milk, and then you pour in vinegar or some type of acid, and the cheese will separate from the cream, and then you have paneer. That's what paneer is. And I made that for myself for a long time once I discovered that was a thing. When I was living in China, I was trying all these different cooking techniques, but it's very cheap in India, And it's a great substitute for meat because you can grill it and fry it and it doesn't melt. It has a strong texture, a little bit chewy, a little meat-like if you cook it enough. But it tastes delicious and extremely fresh. Because it's from these cows that have fantastic milk, and then you pour some lemon juice or whatever into the milk, all the curds separate, and then you have brand new spanking cheese straight from the cow an hour ago. Or even like 15, as soon as you have the milk, you put in any acid and it separates into the cheese, and you can strain out the cheese curds, and then you have paneer. Fantastic. So I got a lot of paneer while I was in India, just because it was so fresh, just because dairy products were so fresh in India. Okay, so speaking of how fresh they are, because I believe their diet, I want to go back to their waste, because I noticed there were a lot of what looked like coal sitting on the side of the road drying in the sun. And when I saw it, like some of it was more wet than other ones. They were all drying in the sun. And I was just like, oh, is that waste? Is that dung? Because there was no smell, so I wondered, why are they drying charcoal in the sun? And I thought about it for a while, and then I asked one of the fluent English speakers I talked to. I talked to so many fluent English speakers in India that I can't remember who it was. It was probably the genius student, who I'll tell you about soon. And they explained that, yeah, people use cow manure for coal, which, if you're American, I'm sure you're like, that is disgusting. How could you use poop for coal? If you dry it and then you burn it, you're going to have a burned poop smell. But not so in India. That was shocking to me because I had smelled this sort of wood smoke smell when I was riding my bike around outside some of the even more rural neighborhoods, like a few miles away from where I was. They all heated their houses by fire, and I assumed it was some kind of firewood. And then I realized that they were using this dung. They just put it into like fist-sized pieces and then put that on the sun. When it dried, you could light it on fire. It burned, and it burned clean. There's a smell that smells like wood smoke. It smells like you're burning wood. It does not smell at all like you are burning animal dung, or what I expected animal dung burning to smell like. Wood smoke in the US similarly bothers my sinus and eyes, and I don't particularly like the smell. And there's really no difference between that smell and the smell of this burning, dehydrated dung. The smell itself is different. It just smells like a different type of wood, but it definitely smells like a different type of wood. It doesn't smell like dung. It's shocking. It's really interesting because I always heard about how Mongolians apparently do the same thing. They make coal out of their cow dung, their yak dung up in the Mongolian steppes, and they use every part of it, right? And the dung is a part of that. And I always wondered how that worked, like how you could possibly cook with that fire or get warm without being completely disgusted by the smell of dung. But now that I've been in India and realized how inoffensive, how completely normal, how vegetative the natural cow manure smells like, I can see why it would be easy to use that as a heat source for cooking or for heating. And you know what, since we're already talking about the cows, I might as well keep on that route because it was so cool to see cows just walking around and completely respected by every Indian person. It is very much, a lot of the fluent English speakers explained to me, like, yeah, the cow is a god, and you are a god, and I'm a god. Everybody is divine, I think was their point. But the cows especially are an actual divine animal. And so the cows will stand in the middle of the road, and cars will slow down and steer around them and then keep driving. And you're never going to hear someone honk at a cow because that's like honking at a god to get out of the way. No, the cow gets to do what the cow wants to do in India. And it's pretty cool, not just because there's a bunch of animals walking around, but because there's large animals. Cows are big. I don't know how many of you listeners are city slickers, like I certainly at least was and mostly still am growing up. Like that's where my sensibilities were raised. And I'm used to nothing larger than a Labrador or golden retriever being in an urban situation. And maybe not in the middle of the city, but in India, you can have cows walking around. I was living more out, like I said, in the rural countryside with farms and all that kind of stuff. And there were cows just walking around everywhere. But I loved it because giant, tall, 1,000-pound animals calmly walking around perfectly at ease with the people, the humans around them, and the traffic, and even the dogs and cats. Like, none of the animals bothered each other, and none of the animals and humans got in any fisticuffs, got in any altercations. It was just really interesting to be in a country that so respected this one animal simply because of tradition and religion, that it was an integral part of society and a very respected, cared for part of society. And everyone is entirely comfortable around these huge animals. I did one time see a guy moving a cow off the street because his truck was too big to drive around the cow, and he had to kind of push it a little forcefully, not smacking it in any way, but he had I think he had a stick or something, and he was just trying to leverage the cow's rump up so it would know I have to get out of here. And even just that little tap, I had already been living in India for a couple months, and when I saw him touching the cow, I was like, whoa. I was slightly scandalized because of what a wide berth cows are given in general. And the cow it got up after he nudged it several times, and it did move off the road, and then he kept driving. But that said, I've also seen 3 cows in the middle of a tiny 1.5 lane, not even 2-lane road, where when cars pass, they often have to drive to the right to not hit each other on the road. And 3 cows will just be laid out, just hanging out in the middle of the road, lying down. And there's basically no danger of a car hitting them. People, at least where I was, didn't drive that fast in general. And they always had an eye out for cows, because a cow could just walk out of the brush, because again, it's not manicured, monocultured grass or something. It's like half a forest or very tall grasses. So a cow could just walk out of that side of the road at any point onto the road, and it has the right of way, no matter what. You do not have the right of way walking or driving a vehicle or anything. That cow is the divine animal that has the right of way. So I would often just watch these cows in the middle of the road, and people in vehicles not even not seeing them, not seeing them, but it was as natural when a cow was standing in the middle of the road and they had to drive their car around it or ride their bicycle around the cow. It was as natural as if a tree was there. It's not that they didn't notice the cow. It was so absolutely natural to have 1,000-pound, 5-foot cow in the middle of the road that it was interesting. It was fascinating to watch a lot of the time. Just watching cars deftly maneuver around the obstacle in the road, and then they just kept going. And they're animals. Animals, I love looking at animals, and this was a giant, mobile, healthy animal respected by the entire country, respected by everyone, moving about as it pleased. And sometimes they'd be being driven by the shepherd back to the paddock at night or out to the fields in the morning. But they were driven out, and then they were left alone all day, by the shepherd who just let them graze and then taken back in. And their dung was collected, separated into parts and dehydrated into coal. and they were milked and everything. It was really cool just having such a living in an animal-centric society where it's not just, like, it wasn't just a society where they revered a kangaroo, for instance. Like, they were like, that is our spirit animal. We love that animal. No, this was the animal is part of your life. It's obstructing your traffic. It's eating on the side of the road everywhere. Its dung is being burned for heat sources in various locations. It's like this, living divine spiritual thing just walking around in real life. And the way everybody treats it like a divine animal makes it feel much more like a divine animal. It's really cool. And everybody's delighted. They like it when the cows do something funny because they all appreciate this animal that does so much for them. They take the milk and make their paneer, which is a huge source of protein for everybody in India. And you get to be near these cultural points, like the cows become a cultural focus point, I'll say, like a spiritual focus point of all of their extremely broad but also deep devotion to the divine in general, the Indian people's breadth and depth of ritual and divinity. It's right alongside their appreciation for the entire world as a holistic system. Fascinating to see it. And so the cows can kind of get away with anything. It's pretty great. And what's really funny is when a cow will just stare down a car. It's like, I'm not moving for this one. And the guy in the car isn't going to do anything. He'll be like, come on, move, but he'll wait. He might honk his horn. That's not very... I didn't see that happen a lot, people honking their horns at cows. But if the cow just stood there, people will just wait until the cow... They're not going to inch their car forward, because if you hit a cow, I can't imagine what people would do to you if you hit a cow with a car. But, I mean, you might do something to yourself feeling so bad about attacking a divine being. They just wait, and the cow just looks, and in its own time, it saunters away, or doesn't. Sometimes it'll just stay there, and the person will have to wait until there's no cars and then drive all the way on the other side of the road or off the road so they can avoid the cow if they really need to keep going. And I think one of my favorite things I ever saw, I was going down the road to buy one of my normal dinners. Man, the food is so good in India, and it's so simple, so fresh. I haven't talked about the food yet. That's wild. We'll talk about that soon. I want to finish cows first. Cows, the funniest thing that happened, I was on my way to get dinner on my bicycle, and actually it was on the way back. I looked over, and the convenience store, I like to go to this one convenience store that had a cone ice cream that I liked better than the other ones. I don't know why, but it just tasted better to me. And the shop looked different. It was this tiny convenience store, like maybe 3 meters, 10 feet wide, and maybe 15 feet deep, like 4 or 5 meters deep. So pretty tiny. And it just looked different to me. And I went there all the time, so I wasn't sure. I was like, oh, is it closed? No, it's open, but like... And then I realized that it looked different because there was a cow standing in it. There's a full-sized adult cow had walked into the convenience store, and half of those 3 meters is taken up by the cash register side where they ring you up. So there's only like 4 feet, maybe 5 feet of space on the other side. 4 feet. It was a very tiny shop. And the cow had worked its way in, and it hadn't knocked anything off the shelves yet, but it had walked all the way into the shop. It was taking up the entire length of the shop, and just standing there in front of the counter, taking up every square inch of remaining floor space. And the lady I usually bought my ice cream from saw me, and she waved. Everyone was smiling and beaming at the cow and taking videos of it. And she was like laughing at the cow and her husband. Her whole family was just standing behind the counter, just watching the cow visit their shop. And I bet it was a very fortuitous, maybe a little bit of a blessing for the animal to visit their shop so calmly. And I just watched it stand there, just huge cow, like taller than all of them and 1,000 pounds, but just calmly walked straight into a convenience store and then just stood there, glanced around a bit. And it was really cool because I also got to be really close to some of these cows when they walked by me, or sometimes when they would stop by me and look at me, and they were so calm. They were so peaceful because they knew they were not going to be harmed by anything around them. They had never been harmed probably by anything in their lives. And so they just knew they never would be. And so whenever they were curious about something, they'd walk up and stare at it and inspect it. And sometimes that something was me. But they were so calm. They were so laid back. These were some chill cattle, some cool bovine. Everywhere, all of them were. And at some point for a couple weeks, 3 cows started hanging out in front of my house that I was renting. I rode my bike home one day, and again, my brain was just like glitched and was like, what is that? And I couldn't tell what was in front of my house. And in front of the gate outside my house, I realized there were 3 large, what I called calico cows. One of them was brown and white, one of them was white, and one of them was brown. And they were just giant, full, mature, adult cows laying down, just chilling in front of the gate that I needed to go through to get into my house. And I just rode up and got off my bike and said, hello, and then just kept on my way. I didn't want to disturb them or anything. And I had to walk my bike between a couple cows because there was no way in hell I was riding my bike past these cows and have one of their tails twitch in the path of the bike or something like that. And I didn't want to startle them either. And they were right in front of the gate, like a foot in front. They were right next to the gate. There was just a small path to the gate that I had to get through. But I went in there and I just, I looked back at them after I got the bike past them for a little while. And I was just like, how cool is this? Being visited by 3 of the divine animals, and they're just hanging out. And then the next morning they were gone and they had a nice little nap, I guess. And the next evening when I came back from dinner again, all 3 of them were there. All 3 of them were lying down in front of the gate to my house, looking up at me. They're like, oh, there it is again. And I walk by them with the bike and put it away and be like, hey guys. And every time I saw them, I just said, hey, all right, good night. And it was, 3,000 pounds of animal just sitting around. The cows didn't stink either. Like cattle usually smell bad. These cows did not smell bad. Indian cows they didn't have a strong offensive musk or odor. And sometimes I saw people feeding them just on the side of the road. They'd just bring out some rice and feed it to the cows, and the cows would calmly munch it straight from their hands or from a container the people held out. And after they were fed, they'd go walking and then go chew on grass on the side of the road. I saw a lot of people, feeding the cows or leaving food out for them. And the cows ate rice. And maybe that was a treat because rice is kind of more sweet than, weeds on the side of the road. But the cows ate weeds on the side of the road all day also. And it was just a wonderful part of being in India. Being part of a society that so highly valued giant animals living inside their human part, their human society. They were like, yeah, of course, this is where humans live, and this is where cows live also. And that was just like part of their life. I really liked that. I tried to imagine what it would be like in the States if you just lived in a small town and cows just walked around everywhere, totally calm, and people were always, it was part of their life, so they were always paying attention if a cow was about to walk onto the road or cross the road or something, or just what they were doing in their lives. Fascinating to be part of that society. I've never lived in it before, or since. And I'd like to live in another town in India. I like that it's clean. It's obviously, well, I don't know if you know this, it's incredibly cheap to live in India. Even in the expensive parts of India, it's still very inexpensive to live there. So it's nice that it's also cheap to live there. The food is fantastic. And you get to be part of this animist religious society as long as you're living there. And if you can speak English, like I said, there's tons of fluent English speakers, so it's super easy to get around. Even where I was in no man's land, I was pretty far out there. Well, I'm going to make this a several-part series. I expected this was going to happen because it's, I think, one of the first episodes where I just focus on a country and all the stuff I did during a trip there, and there's a lot to talk about, and as you can tell, I like to get pretty deep into each aspect of it. Heat sources from dung still are fascinating to me. I still have trouble believing that it doesn't smell like anything other than wood smoke. But I can assure you, because I was there for 3 months and it never smelled. The cow dung just never smelled. And they smelled houses burning it. I saw people burning it for a heat source and for cooking. And I bought the food that they cooked with it. It tasted completely normal. They were cooking it in a pot, but they were using that coal as the heat source, and it tasted totally normal. It was just like if you cooked a pot over coal. It was just absolutely fascinating. And then living in the animist culture, just how much people respected these animals and how chill the animals were. So I got to be around. And I even touched them a couple times, giant animals. That's so cool to be part of that nature appreciative type of society. That civilized tradition of human and natural coexistence. After I left, my friend just mentioned offhandedly that it's really cool how holistic the Indians live. And that struck me for some reason. And it's because of how true it is. They use everything well. They don't waste much. Everything's clean, and they establish their own space with their own apartments or their own house or something. But at least the town I lived in was very much in commune with the world around them. They don't turn their gardens into monocultures. They don't force the animals into uncomfortable situations. And they know how to use the world around them. They know how to live with the world around them instead of very strictly controlling it or organizing it in a way that's slightly more convenient, maybe for a society of humans, of great harm to the animal or the plants or the rest of the world around them. It's a very holistically natural society to live in. I enjoyed my time living in India a lot, and I was very healthy there because I was largely vegetarian, which agrees with human stomachs pretty darn good, I'll say, especially if everything's so fresh and delicious. And I was outside of the city, so there was no pollution. The stars were always out, the sky was always clear, there was no smoke. It was pretty wonderful. But I was close enough to the city that I could ride my bicycle to it in half an hour or something like that. Yeah, a wonderful visit. And I am surprised we didn't get there yet, but I'm gonna talk about the food in the next one, because I have never been on a vegetarian stint before. I know I experimented with it once for a little while, but never for months like I was when I lived in India, or maybe a couple months. And I got a bunch of interesting stories about their food, and their food is so good. So let's move on to the next episode, and I'll start it off with all the food I was eating in India.